Vou aproveitar, vou aproveitar. Consegue me ouvir? Consegue me ouvir? Sorry. Let me try this. Agora eu consigo ouvir a Júlia. Oi, Júlia, desculpa, com problema de conexão aqui. Can you hear me? Okay, okay.
a merit in bringing poverty and extreme poverty and hunger to the center of the agenda and making the ministers discuss that and discuss in particular social differences, inclusion in growth. And I think the fact that this topic is highlighted in the ministers of finance discussions is an interesting topic. But there is still a long way to go in this, a long way to go. Conceptually, there's still a long way to go. And in practice, there's still a long way to go. So I think that we should, from now, we should look at the G20 with perhaps less enthusiasm or less expectation that big results are going to be presented, but to try to identify what's the value added. What can be the value added of the Brazilian G20? There is some. It's an important value added, and I hope that the meetings would go in the right direction. I'll stop here. Julia.
Okay. So, Luciana, let's try again. Please contact Luciana. They were doing tests in Calamaro. So, let's hope.
Can you hear me?
Luciana.
Can you hear me? I
Olá.
can hear you. Can you hear me?
We listen. Maybe just the audio a little bit higher. Luciana, por favor, falar alguma coisa.
Can you hear me?
Sim, acho que tá bem. Vamos começar então?
Sorry for the connection.
Cortou o áudio. Luciana, we are not listening. Now we don't listen. Não estamos escutando nenhum áudio.
Maybe I should say then a few words about the T20. Just a few words. We've been making from the beginning an effort, first of all, to incorporate think tanks and institutions that were not involved in other think tanks before, in other sessions of the T20 before. I think the name of the game for us is inclusion. And we were very successful, I would say, in bringing in a number of institutions that were not present before, and institutions from countries that were not present. For example, the Chinese were not very much present in the Indian G20 because China and India have difficulties in their own bilateral connection. This is one point. The second point is that I think that we have been very successful in connecting the Brazilian institutions, which are giving a real show in terms of presenting ideas and coordinating the work of different task forces, with the foreign institutions. We had one first meeting, an inception meeting. It was a video meeting. We could not have the presence of everyone. And we expect now to have the second meeting early July, just before the Sherpas meeting, where the think tanks are going to present their own suggestions in the different topics: financial architecture, trade, and poverty alleviation, sustainability, financing for sustainable development, all the different topics. This is going to be, they are going to present their suggestions and recommendations to the Sherpas early July. One very interesting thing is the call for abstracts that was introduced all over the world in different institutions, and we had strong requirements on that because we had requirements that we should have more than one institution involved in any abstract, men and women involved in the individual abstracts. We were very rigid in the requirements for the presentation of the abstracts, and we had like almost 700, isn't it? More than say it. 1,000. Then I see 1,000 abstracts, which is a very interesting response, I would say. The fact that 1,000 people or academics in different institutions are presenting their ideas to the G20, to the T20, is a very interesting proposition. And that the process now is to look at these contributions, to look at these abstracts, and keep discussing the topics at the level of the different task forces. Of course, it's impossible with 1,000 contributions to take into account all of them with the same level of attention and importance. But still, I think the impact of motivating the different people in different institutions to participate is a very positive one. And then I go back to my previous point. I think that this idea of connecting society, academics, institutions, and government discussions is really one of the very positive points about the G20 and the T20. And the initiative that Brazil took in having this discussion with the Sherpas and then previous to the presidential meetings, I think it's a big step. It has a meaning. It has a meaning for the future. And the fact that a number of institutions that are not participating in the task forces decided to motivate their academics or students to present the briefs is also a very good sign. I think that the spirit in the T20 at this point in time is a very positive one, and I hope that we will have some contribution, if not to the governments immediately, but for the future framing and discussion of the international topics before the T20.
Thank you, Marcos. Yeah. So just complementing, so it's confirmed July 1st and 2nd at the Brazilian Development Bank will be the midterm of the T20 in Rio de Janeiro, and October will be the summit to be decided the date. And Ana Garcia is coordinator of the task force, so please, Ana.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Sebri. Thank you, Ana Célia, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to represent the BRICS Policy Center as one of the think tanks very much engaged in the T20, but also as a researcher, professor. I come originally from the Federal Rural University of Rio de Janeiro, following, monitoring, researching on the G20 since the 2008 crisis. I'm not going to say since the beginning, because 1999, I was researching something else. I think the ALCA process, the FTAA process at that time, at the very beginning. So thank you, Ambassador Camuru, for this great overview of the challenges and also the opportunities that the G20 brings to us in Brazil. Quickly coming from the inside of the T20 process, I was just talking to Luciana before, it has been from a sense of the connections, the networking, the human beings in there. It has been really a pleasure because we are lucky to have excellent experts, excellent specialists, but also very good people to work with. So it's been a major, it has been a pleasant time, in my case, to work with Hai Honggao in China. She's coming here this next week in a delegation from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She will be at SEBRE next week. So it's a huge opportunity and has been a pleasure time to work with, in our case, 16 co-chairs along 5 subtopics. We are working on the topic of reforming the international financial architecture, which is, as Ambassador just spoke, actually the embryonic topic of the G20. We have to remember that G20, if we're talking about the future, where does it start? What is the past of the G20? It is exactly the topic of the crisis. How to manage crisis, how to contain crisis, and how to reform institutions, rules, and the financial systems to avoid future crises. So this was the main topic of the G20, the very origin of the G20 in its creation. We know that in the 2008 crisis, the G20 turned to be also a political coalition, a political group. And what is special about the G20 is that it involves the traditional powers of the G7, the now Eastern powers, China and Russia, emerging powers such as India, and what we now call the Global South, or developing economies, Indonesia, Argentina, South Africa, Brazil, I would include Brazil there, and also now the African Union. And for that reason, I think that the G20 is representative, but it's still a club of a few. So this is an issue that is being very much discussed in terms of to what extent some of the topics which are now in the G20 should not be discussed in the UN, in the broader, bigger forum. And I would, for instance, bring the topic of taxation. I was just yesterday in a discussion, was really good discussion at T20 side event. And many of the presenters were pointing to the necessity of bringing the issue of taxation of multinationals and of global wealth to the UN committee, not to stay within the club of the few, a little bit expanded, which is the OECD G20 inclusive framework. On the other hand, the G20, with that representation, means that the geopolitical tensions are brought into the group. And this was very clear in 2029 in Indonesia. This was again clear last year in India, as China didn't participate. And it's clear now in some of the topics that we are dealing with, for example, the issue of debt and how to relieve the debt and how to deal with the debt crisis in some of the African and Latin American countries. And why is that so important for the G20? And our co-chairs have been discussing that a lot, because it's an opportunity to bring to the same table the traditional creditors, UK, US, the World Bank, and China. So the G20 reflects that political structure today. So there are a few topics that are essential for discussion within the G20, and our task force deals with a few of them. And other topics that we need to say, we have to discuss it among a broader range of actors. Our task force is working, as I said, with the original issues, the original concerns of the creation of the G20, which is financial regulation, financial stabilization, financial rule, the global financial safety net. It's dealing with the reform of the multilateral development banks. Professor Hernani here is dealing with this topic, and we're trying now to work a little closer to the finance track in this issue, because we know that they are working in the same roadmap as we have to, and we need to establish a strong and good dialogue to try to converge our recommendations with what exactly is being planned in the working group within the finance track. But at the same time, we are asked to not to be limited to the government's decisions, but to go beyond as think tanks and to propose more and to be more creative in our recommendations, and I think this is very important. The other subtopic that we are working on is the debt issue, and as said, for this topic we have 4 co-chairs working on the policy briefs and the recommendations from UK, France, South Africa, and Argentina. And I was very concerned about bringing people from Argentina to this topic when I was creating the co-chairs group. I was, back in December, Fabio from IPEA and I were talking a lot in that time, because I was concerned about having people who have experienced in the T20 already, since I didn't before, and Hai Hong did, but also new faces. Not to have, the usual suspects, but to bring those new faces, to bring new ideas in. So I got to invite someone from CONICET and from Flaxo, Argentina, who works very much on the IMF, to this topic, and also someone from South Africa, not to have only the European co-chairs there. The other topic is the tax reform and taxation, the reform of the tax architecture. And in this subtopic, we have very important representatives of intergovernmental organizations. One is the G24, Dr. Yabo Masha. She's a very important representative of these issues for developing countries. And the South Center, representatives of the South Center come from various countries, and there are intergovernmental representatives and also from think tanks. And they were very, very critical, I would say, towards the inclusive framework agreement of the OECD. And we combined that with other co-chairs who had a more balanced view to try to bring into the discussion very concrete recommendations. And I think that this topic is precious for the Brazilian government this year. The finance minister was very strong in that area, and the finance track is working strongly, not only to improve the OECD agreement, but also to move beyond it and to start the discussion on the taxation of global wealth, and not only on the global revenues that multinationals make around the world. And the last, but definitely not least topic, is the finance for development, the whole issue of how we bring all these revenues coming from the other topics, debt, debt relief, taxation, etc., stabilization, to the objectives that we have in terms of development. So hunger, climate, all the gender, all the issues that are important for developing countries. So overall, this is an overview of our work. We are right now working on 58 policy briefs, relatively balanced along those 5 subtopics. We hope that we can develop good and strong recommendations on this heart, I would say, of the G20. But as said, I think that we have to think about how to move beyond the government's proposal, how to be creative, and I think the panel today will discuss exactly this, how to be creative in terms of the G20 future.
Thank you so much, Ana Garcia. So we're going to just do a last try. As Luciana said, she changed her internet. If it doesn't work, maybe later she'll send a video, and then I'll ask Leonardo to join. So let's try, Kyle. Luciana, última tentativa. Está liberado o som? Okay.
No.
Unfortunately, not working. No. Okay. So Luciana will send a video later, and then maybe we'll pass in the end of the day. So thank you so much, Ambassador Marcos Caramuru, Ana Garcia, to join us. But then, unfortunately, so let's ask Luciana to send the video. So, and then I invite Leonardo Bulamaki to join here because he's coordinating the next panel. Thank you so much.
So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the closing panels of this great meeting, and the usual thanks for Ana and the whole team that worked hard for making this possible. And in this panel, we have a sort of an asymmetry because we have too many smart people and not too much time, which means I will have to enforce the rules with a certain amount of, let's say, decisiveness. So I asked our colleagues in the back to show the signs with 5 minutes, 3 minutes, and time's up. So I'll be dealing with that from here, but we'll also have a little help from our friends in the back, so that whoever is here will understand that the time is going and going fast. As for the very few, because of this vast number of people, smart people that will be talking, my introduction or my introductory comments will be short. And they will depart from Ambassador Kamaru great optimism, I would say. I won't be so optimist. In fact, if I had to give a title to this panel, it wouldn't be the G Futures panel. It would be, is there a future for the G20? That is exactly the way I see it. And I have just like two phrases in the background. I have as background for this 8 years of my life, 6 of which in New York, working for the Ford Foundation in an initiative, global, called Reforming Global Governance. When the crisis exploded in 2008, it became Reforming Financial Governance. Robert remembers that very well. And we had the best, not only researchers, experts, and NGOs, but also decision makers on board. And the initiative was global, and the climate was very, let's say, inviting in terms of searching for coordinated solutions. Well, after 6 years in New York and plus 2 years here at the Ford Foundation, working for New York, but in Rio de Janeiro, the results, I have to say, were not great, not bright, and we still sort of digesting that. The other piece of background that I just want to raise here, because to preface the few comments I will have, is that I am a big fan of a international relations theorist called John Mearsheimer. And for John Mearsheimer, this whole idea of G20 would sound really weird. Why? Because he has a whole career dedicated at something called great power politics. And great power politics means, well, international politics and international relations and geopolitics are really managed by great powers, not by G20, G7, I don't know how many people want to transform G20 in G50. He would say, this is crazy. We have 3 great powers today: US, China, and Russia. And so that's where the game is going to be played. Other than that, there is not much room for big initiatives. Maybe for a lot of good, interesting, exciting, intellectually stimulating discussions, for sure. But actions, when we say we should change X, Y, or Z, John would say, and I would agree, we? Who are we? We? Who? The G20 as a whole? Complicated. So, just to finish up, we are today in the opposite end. The other end, if we compare with 99 or 2008, in the sense that where some concerted actions were tried, at least, to solve global problems. Today we have what? Political polarization, tech wars, commercial wars, military wars, right? Look at Ukraine, look at Israel. Western liberal democracies are losing legitimacy by the minute, and I would say with very good reasons for that. Global governance institutions are really in tatters. They're not working. We have a multipolar world with an increasingly dysfunctional hegemon. Let's think about Trump back in the White House, in the very high probability of that happening. So I finish asking, should we expect coordinated solutions to nearly intractable problems such as climate change? Well, I don't think so. But a pessimist can always be disappointed, and I hope I will be disappointed. And with that, I invite my good friend Robert Wade, which doesn't need an introduction in most places, especially here. Just two sentences, professor at LSE, and one of the founding fathers of the whole literature and the whole thinking about the Asian developmental state, which is a super classic book, Governing the Market. Okay, Robert, thanks for coming. The floor is yours.
Good. Well, many thanks. It was really impressive to hear Ambassador Karamuru and Anna talk about all the great things that are being done by this complex around the G20. And does this work? Yes, yes. Okay. So I'm going to be, let's say, a little bit more controversial, pessimistic, in proposing that the G20 should really be replaced by a properly constituted, legitimately constituted Global Economic Council. I'm making a distinction between input, in terms of organizational legitimacy, I'm making a distinction between input legitimacy of an organization, which relates especially to the representativeness of the organization, and on the other hand, the output legitimacy or the effectiveness of the organization. And the ambassador and Anna were talking especially on the output side. I'm going to be talking about the input side. And I begin with this striking aphorism from Giordano Bruno, just before he was burnt alive at the stake by the Roman Inquisition in 1600, because he disputed the divinity of Christ and he agreed with Galileo's views of the universe. And he said, "It is naive to think that power will reform power." So I'm calling for power to reform power, but I know that I am being, and anybody who makes this argument is being very naive to think that this is actually going to happen. So that's the beginning. And I will remind you of what President Lula said at the UN General Assembly, September 2008. So just as the great financial crisis was unfolding, the global nature of this crisis means that the solutions we adopt must be global, and this is the key point from my input legitimacy side, and decided upon within legitimate, trusted, multilateral fora with no impositions. The United Nations, as the world's largest multilateral arena, must issue a call for a vigorous response to these threats. So let me just remind you of how the G20 at leaders level came to be created. The leaders level as distinct from the finance ministers level created in 1999. September 2008, the North Atlantic financial crisis began. It's always puzzling to me that, and not puzzling to me that we call it the global financial crisis, whereas we talk of the East Asian financial crisis, the Latin American crisis, but strangely enough, when the crisis was originated in the North Atlantic countries, we don't call it we in the North Atlantic don't call it the North Atlantic crisis. We call it the global crisis, which is really to say not to do with us, not our fault. It's the Latin Americans' fault for the Latin American crisis, the East Asians' fault for the East Asian crisis, but not ours, it's global. And so the president of the General Assembly appointed, very much agreed that the UN General Assembly was the appropriate big venue for handling this crisis, and appointed a commission of experts on the reform of the international and monetary system, chaired by Joe Stiglitz. And this commission's report endorsed the UN General Assembly as the appropriate big venue, with then smaller venues operating under the General Assembly. Well, you can imagine how well that proposal was received by the Bush administration in Washington. The very last thing that they wanted was any involvement in the UN. And so Bush was very reluctant to agree initially to upgrade the G20F finance ministers to the G20L leaders level. He was very reluctant, but he saw this was the one way to marginalize the UN, keep the UN out of it. And so the G20L was created. It met in November 2008 for the first time. And the good thing from the US point of view was that the Stiglitz Commission and the whole initiative to get the UN involved, all that sank without trace. That was the object, that was the main reason for raising the G20 up to the leaders level, at least in US terms. Now, from the beginning, the G20 leaders has provoked very strongly polarized responses. For example, at one end, President Sarkozy said the G20 foreshadows the planetary governance of the 21st century. And many other champions have said, yes, the G20 at leaders level and below is a good steering committee for the world economy. It is a good steering committee for the world economy. On the other hand, the foreign minister of Norway, and who's now the president of Norway, the prime minister of Norway, said the G20 is one of the greatest setbacks since the Second World War. The Financial Times, to my surprise, was also quite negative. In an editorial, it said, the G20 show how not to run the world. Ian Bremmer, Nouriel Roubini, they renamed the G20 the G0, as a cacophony of competing voices undermining global economic cooperation with no country willing to set an international agenda. And I know that Ian Bremmer at least thinks much the same today as he did back in 2011. So I want to make the argument that G20 has at least 4 basic legitimacy problems on the inputs or the representational side, not talking about all the good things that Ambassador and Anna were describing to us that it is doing and so on, and could do. The first problem is that the current membership of the G20 was selected on the basis of no explicit criteria, number one. Number two, there's no mechanism for adding or dropping countries as the relative economic weight changes over time. Number three, the most fundamental legitimacy problem on the input side, the G20 has no mechanism of universal representation such that all states are incorporated into a representational structure as they are in the World Bank and the IMF, which means that about 170 states in the world are permanently, and I underline that word, permanently excluded from the G20, despite what the ambassador described to us of all the good work of the T20 in getting policy briefs from all around the world. That really, I mean, that's important, but it doesn't do much to reduce this fundamental problem of the illegitimacy on the representation side of the G20. And of course, the fourth problem, Africa grossly underrepresented, South Africa the only member. Now, as of right now, almost just a few months ago, the African Union has agreed to join. Low-income countries are excluded. Small, open economies are excluded. And so this is the basic point. And it's strange to me that it is getting so little attention because the G20 is just obviously, I mean, in your face, illegitimate. It means that Argentina is always in, Costa Rica, Colombia, always out. Indonesia, always in. Malaysia, always out. Malaysia and Singapore. Britain, always in. Ireland, always out. France, always in. Nordic Baltics, always out. Australia, always in. New Zealand, always out. Now, I come from New Zealand, and I happen to know that the Australian government and the Australian diplomats get great pleasure in underlining to their New Zealand counterparts that you are out. We're not even going to talk to you. But it plays out in another kind of context, which Ruggiero may know something about from personal experience. This is a microcosm of how it plays out. On the board of the World Bank, I have been doing interviews, conversations with executive directors at the World Bank that sit on the governing body of the World Bank. And executive directors from constituencies which are permanently out, tell me that when they speak at the board meetings, the executive directors from the G20 countries, they take out their phones and they begin to do other kind of business, and they don't pay any attention to what these executive directors from non-G20 countries, because they know that these non-G20 countries don't count, they don't matter. So why should we, executive directors from G20 countries, pay attention to what you marginal people are saying? That's a microcosm of how it plays out. So I want to go on and now start a more positive dialogue in terms of the sweet spot in the dilemma between effectiveness on the one hand and input legitimacy on the other. So this is the dilemma. On the one hand, smaller bodies with fewer people sitting at the table are much more like-minded, likely to be much more like-minded, such as the G7, for example, and therefore more effective in reaching policy solutions. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, they lose legitimacy because they exclude more of those who are expected to comply with whatever this small group decides. And then, on the other hand, larger bodies gain legitimacy because they're more inclusive, but they're less likely to be effective because they're less like-minded. There's more difference within the group. And the sweet spot is where the active participants are fairly small in number, so that gets effectiveness, raises effectiveness, but the active participants form part of a system of representation in which all of those who are expected to comply with the decisions, namely the whole membership, are represented in this system in one way or another, and in which the active participants, the people sitting at the table, rotate amongst the whole membership rather than having just one set of people. So the proposal that I'm going to make for a legitimately constituted Global Economic Council draws on the representation system of the Bretton Woods. For example, the IMF has 190 member states, and they are all represented in the key decision-making board, namely the executive board of the IMF. And the World Bank is much the same. The IMF executive board has 24 seats, now approved to go up to 25 to give another seat to Africa. And the World Bank has 25 seats. So that's the number, about 24, 25. That's considered to be a good compromise. In the IMF, 8 states represent only themselves, and all the other states are gathered in constituencies in which there's one executive director and 1 or 2 alternates, deputies to the executive director. And within each constituency, the occupancy of the executive director and of the alternates rotates over time. So eventually, all countries in the constituency can expect to have some direct representation at the decision-making table. Now, coming on then to how this would work in a newly constituted, legitimately constituted Global Economic Council, in terms of representation, and I'll go on in a minute to talk about voice and voting as distinct from representation. So in this model, this is a very, very simplified model. The executive board of the Global Economic Council has 25 seats, all of them constituencies. In other words, no country represents only itself. Everybody is every state is in a constituency. The world is divided into 4 regions: Africa, Americas, Asia, Europe, 4 regions. And of the 25 seats, 16 seats, that is 2/3, are allocated equally between the 4 regions, with 4 seats per region. And this is particularly because we think that to get a stable world order, we have to give much more representation to regions, as distinct to simply to countries with big GDPs. So 16 seats allocated equally between 4 regions, and 9 seats allocated between regions according to the region's share of world GDP. And the bottom line of this representation system then is that Africa has 4 seats and the other 3 regions have 7 seats sitting on the board of executive directors. Now, in terms of voting, the G20 operates on the principle of consensus, which obviously generates a race to the least common denominator. In contrast, we argue that the Global Economic Council should operate on a principle of majority vote, or at least like the Bretton Woods organizations, the principle of consensus. This is in the board discussions. The decision is made by consensus, but it's consensus formed in the shadow of the voting system. That is, everybody knows that what the US says in the board counts much more than what most other countries say in the board. So there's a kind of blend between consensus and voting in these organizations. And the other point to make is that no state in the Global Economic Council should have a veto. Of course, remember what Bruno said. It is naive to expect that power will reform power. You can imagine the US response to the suggestion it should give up its veto. It will veto that suggestion it should give up its veto, of course. Kamal Dervis, who was a leading figure in the World Bank and also at one time finance minister of Turkey, proposed a global and economic and social security council in 2005, in which he said each country's share of votes should be based on 3 variables: 1, its share of world GDP; 2, share of world population; and 3, contributions to global public goods. He said each of these 3 variables should have equal weight. We're skeptical of that proposal, in particular because if population has equal weight to the others, then this organization is clearly dominated by China and India. But the second reason is because this variable, contributions to global public goods, is wide open to manipulation. There will be all kinds of fighting about what should be included in this. And so our proposal for the distribution of votes is that each country's share of votes is to be equal to its share of world GDP, qualified by basic votes, which are votes allocated to each member state equally. Basic votes are intended to ensure that small, low-income countries are not marginalized completely. And at the start of Bretton Woods, 1945-6, basic votes were 10% of the total votes, but that share has shrunk now to 2%. Only 2% of total votes are for basic votes, which makes the small countries even more marginal than they are in other ways. So we say that the Global Economic Council should institute basic votes at 10% of the total and maintain that share through an automatic mechanism. Then, of course, there's this very, very toxic subject of how GDP should be measured. I mean, if you talk to people in the World Bank and the IMF at the board level, there's a real big tension between how much weight to give to GDP at purchasing power parity and how much weight to give to GDP at market valuations of exchange rates. And so we propose a simple composite measure that is nominal GDP, market GDP should be weighted 50%, and purchasing power parity GDP weighted at 50%. Now, some anticipated objectives. It's pie in the sky. This is Giordino Bruno's point. The G20 states are no more likely to approve any such move than Turkeys are to vote for Christmas. We agree with this, but we are simply concerned to keep the idea of replacing the G20 with something which is basically representational of the whole of the world system of states. We want to keep that on the discussion agenda, even though we know it's very far from the decision agenda. So the second objective is that even if it were feasible to replace the G20 with something like the Global Economic Council, it's a bad idea because it would replace one forum for institutionalizing disagreements with an even bigger forum for institutionalizing disagreements. And in particular, right now, geo-economic political tensions are so high that those disagreements would prevail over any likely agreements. So this argument goes on to say that progress on solving global problems is more likely to come via building small coalitions of like-minded countries. That's the key phrase, like-minded countries. These might be regional, they might be sub-regional, they might be trans-regional, such as the BRICS, for example, a striking example of small group trans-regional coalitions. And I don't need to spend time on this point. It's just that small groups are much more likely to be like-minded than larger groups. And you see this clearly in terms of the contrast between the G7, which is small and able to reach agreements, and the G20. And basically the G20 from the beginning has been steered by the G7 because the G7 is much more like-minded over what it wants from the G20 than the other non-G7 countries are. And just to give an example of this argument in a particular case, this is a statement, or this is a summary of the argument of Thaman, who is the current president of Singapore, and he has been Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Industry, Minister of Education, and so on. When he was Deputy Prime Minister in 2018 and chair of the G20 Eminent Persons Group on Global Financial Governance, he said that collaboration between states should be sought in different fora on specific problems rather than defend existing institutions such as the G20. That's very striking because he was the chair of the G20 eminent group, and he was saying we need to rethink the whole idea of the G20 and focus on forming coalitions of states focused on specific problems. The priority should be to build networks that include the states most implicated in specific challenges. That's a very different principle than the principle of the G20. So I agree, that there should be, yes, much more interstate collaboration based on like-minded groups of states. But in addition to that, the world also needs apex representative forums for bringing the heads of government and people lower down the state structures together in regular face-to-face talking, because regular talking can tip the balance from a winning or losing mentality towards what Daniel Kahneman described, you know, the psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics, described as adversarial collaboration. That should be what we aim at in these apex bodies, to find areas where there is adversarial, where there's collaboration even between states that are somewhat adversarial. And just to underline this point, this is the debate about the US Constitution as it was being written in 1787. Many people at the time the US Constitution was being written were anti a federalist state. They said that a republic could work only if people were relatively homogeneous and in broad agreement. Alexander Hamilton was one who said that's wrong. He went on to say the differences of opinion and the jarrings of parties, meaning the clash of parties, the jarrings of parties in the legislature often promote deliberation and circumspection and serve to check excesses in the majority. And of course, Hamilton's argument for what Kahneman would call adversarial collaboration prevailed, and the US Constitution embodies that principle. What about the authority of the Global Economic Council? Should it appoint the heads of the Bretton Woods organizations? That would be quite a change, because for 80 years, the Bretton Woods organizations have said, we appoint the heads of the World Bank and the IMF according to merit. But mysteriously, merit always yields an American as head of the World Bank and a European as head of the IMF. Now, if this was in the charge of the Global Economic Council, that would be ended. That strange practice would be ended. Then there's a larger question. Should the Global Economic Council become the twin of the UN Security Council? Should it be the governance umbrella for all of the UN's economic and social agencies, even with authority to appoint the heads of all these agencies, including FAO, including UNIDO, and so on? Of course, if Trump, and this is what the ambassador was talking about, if Trump is re-elected president, then we are in an even more disrupted world than we are at the moment. In particular, I draw your attention to the fact that the Heritage Foundation is making detailed plans for the second Trump administration, crystallized in a document of 1,000 pages called Project 2025. And this document makes clear that this phrase, defending our nation's sovereignty, is one of its and Trump's top priorities, and it translates this phrase, defending our nation's sovereignty, into marginalizing, we will marginalize the UN, NATO, Bretton Woods, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and of course, it would marginalize also the G20 and any potential successor. Thank you. So, what's next?
A bunch of bright people will come here and debate and discuss. So you can sit down, make yourself comfortable. This is mine. Okay, thank you very much, Robert, for a thoughtful and very creative presentation. I'm afraid that you did not reverse my pessimism. I think you reinforced it. So I stick with Giordano Bruno and with Mersheimer. And I even suggest that whoever wants to really talk seriously about any reform of the G20 has to debate and tackle and go deeper into Mersheimer's arguments in terms of liberal dreams and international realities, which is the title of this, not this latest book, but the one before, the one who really made him famous after the first one. Well, two books. So I invite you to really debate the ideas, the key ideas of Mersheimer, if you really want to talk seriously about a G20 reform. But let's see what our bright commentators have to say about that. I'm not sure if you prefer to come all of you and sit down, or if whoever is going to be commenting comes and the others can just listen. That's up to you. My first question is for Anna. Are you coming to this panel as well? Okay, so no, it's because you talked before. No, good. But so if so, then you could come. If the others want to come and sit here, it will be obviously great, but I would say it'd be smarter to stay where you are so that you can listen to whoever is talking, and then you can come. The time is going to be managed from there. Okay, so please, Anna, the floor is yours. Okay, so I will invite my great friend Hernani Torres, to come to the floor. In the order that I have here, Hernani, Ambassador Kamaru. Okay, I'll see. Okay. Then Hernani Torres, the floor is yours. You can come here if you want, or I will vanish and sit there.
Okay. Good morning to you all. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to discuss a little bit of your question. Is there a future for G20? I've been working with Anna on the G20, and I see that there are a lot of people around the world that sees the G20 as a way through their desirable futures. There are a lot of desirable futures. And one of the reasons why there's a lot of desirable futures is because there are no costs for a desirable future. You have just to be creative, and maybe some poetic skills help a lot. But we've seen a lot of desirable futures. But possible futures, I think that's what you had in mind, are a little bit harder to build up, Decisions for a possible future take a long time and take lots of money. And it takes a lot of money being invested for a long time. That means people will have to get their futures into investment projects, trying to finance it and try to get people to bear the risk of their project. So if we take into consideration, for example, one of our most desirable futures, which is related to energy transition, the amounts of money that are related to energy transition are quite huge. It means 125 trillion investments, maybe 5 or 6 trillion a year. It's very hard to try. So if we take just renewable power alone, this will mean something around 1 trillion a year, and it's being invested around 500 billion only. So where does this gap could be closed? How do we get that? One of the things that the G20 has, one of the possibilities that is open with the G20 is the multilateral development banks. They have been here for more than 50 years, and they are been working on that issues, and G20 has an important say on those institutions. And it's interesting when we look at their balance sheets. 90% of all the liabilities are denominated in dollars and euros. They don't issue bonds in other currencies than Europe or US. Why? In the past, there will be a lot of reasons for that because less developed countries didn't have any, then they have their own capital markets. But that has changed a lot. If you take just Brazil for an example, in 2000, Brazilian public bonds, Brazilian public treasury debts, their duration will be less than a year. More than 60% were dollar denominated. This has changed during next years, and in 2008, we already had a public market for treasury bonds, and we financed Brazilian countercyclical investments through public bonds. Nowadays, the change in Brazil, and it's similar in other less developed countries, has increased a lot private funding. We have almost, let's say, $2 trillion in total assets in Brazil, including private and public bonds. There is a huge liquid market in local currency denominated bonds. So why don't multilateral development banks don't issue bonds in our market? They lend in dollar-denominated loans, which make the local investor, bear the costs of exchange risks. They do it because they want to preserve their AAA risk with the risk agencies overseas. But I think this is one of the issues that could be changed by G20, for example, try to change. If they issue here and lend here, they wouldn't bear any exchange risk at all on their balance sheets. Nominal rates would be higher, but local investors could be more willing to take the money and use them on targeted or earmarked investments, particularly in energy transition. There will be probably political difficulties. Treasury wouldn't like to have competition. Local development banks wouldn't like it at all. But this is a political issue that has to be achieved. So my point is, there is some desirable futures and there are possible futures. The problem is they are not easy to get through. Okay, that's my point. Thank you.
If we would navigate on the basis of desires, then all the problems will be solved by now. So with that note, I invite Ambassador Karamaru to, again, yeah, always. Please. Here or there.
Look, first of all, let me say that I now realize that I sounded optimistic. It was not my intention. but anyway, it shows that I have an optimist spirit, much stronger than my negative views about reality. I found your presentation very, very intriguing, I would say. And I think that someone who discusses the future after the G20 is a big step. But if we are going to discuss the future after the G20, I'm going to propose to start from scratch. I'll propose how was the G20 initiated? And I say this from experience because I was the first Sherpa of Brazil at the financial G20. The G20 was born out of the Asian crisis because at that time, the general perception was that crises are made or are initiated by countries that have strong fiscal imbalances and a management of the fiscal accounts in very bad shape. But then the Asian crisis came. And all these countries had very sound fiscal policies in place. And the question was, where's the crisis is coming from? And then, little by little, we started to realize that most of the central banks of these countries had offices in New York and were operating like investment banks because they had huge reserves and they were investing their reserves. And then someone like Larry Summers, who was at that time only the international, the head of the international area of the Treasury, of the US Treasury, they decided, well, we cannot see this situation again. We cannot see a situation that we cannot predict. And then we have to put the countries together and try to identify what's going on in advance. And Larry used to put all the countries together, all the finance ministers and chairman of the central bank, and ask the following questions. Who has reserves invested in the futures market of currencies? You say, who is taking this kind of risk and that kind of risk? And the Europeans were desperate with that because they would have to reveal, what was going on in their own reality. The developing countries, part of them were silent because they had never participated in that kind of discussions. The Latin Americans were in a very comfortable position because we had a lot of experience with crisis, so we could talk easily about crisis. And again, and besides, the minister was Pedro Malan. The chairman of the president of the central bank was Arminio Fraga. People who felt very comfortable in this situation and could challenge the most developed countries, and that was the reality. Then these meetings were very interesting because there was an informal setting. They allowed a lot of informal discussions, perceptions. The meetings were organized in the following way. One minister, or president of the central bank, was invited to initiate a topic without any written paper, and the others would comment on the papers. Of course, countries like Thailand, Indonesia, that were not used to these discussions, they did not really have a strong participation. Or even Russia, they didn't have a strong participation. And then it started like that. But in the first meeting of the T20, the Europeans started to, of the G20, the Europeans started to ask, but why we are here? Why do we have to discuss all these topics with these middle-income countries? It's their problem. They have to behave. And the markets also have to behave. So it's a question of disciplining the countries and disciplining the markets. Why are we sitting here with these guys discussing the topics with them? And then, the G20, the initiated by Larry Summers, lasted by 2 years. And then there was a gap. Nobody knew what to do. And then someone came with the idea of the G30. And this G30 lasted for 1 year, I think. Then the Germans decided that, no, let's convene a G20 again. And then there was a preparatory meeting in Canada, and then the first meeting was in Germany. But everyone very suspicious about the future of that. Very suspicious. But there was an enormous value in the informal discussions among the ministers, an informal value. Now, in 2008, when the G20 became a political instance, the bureaucrats came and dominated the reality. And with the bureaucrats dominating the reality, there are no advancements. The bureaucrats know how to discuss things forever. It's easy because they don't feel that they have the authority to take decisions. And then we started to see the G20 at this point. If you ask me what should be the future, I think the future should be to go back to the informal discussions of the past, to have more informal occasions. But it's very difficult at this point. I think that the future of international relations has to do with values, has to do with living with values from the West, values from the East, values about the political system, values about the economic management. And it's very difficult at this point to understand how you could coordinate these values and find a future way. I think the idea of having different alliances working together works very much. But we all know that we are in a transition period. And in this transition period, the G7, it's always going to be easy for the G7 because they have the same values. It's always going to be difficult for the other countries, even for the BRICS, because the values in the BRICS are different. Now, we'll have to live with an international system. John Bolton, it's hard, it's hard to mention that. He used to say there's no such thing as the United Nations. There's the American power. But it's hard to accept that. And we'll have to live with a system that contemplates the views of the others. The United Nations is only a parliament. And we have to have something more meaningful. That's the G20. Not too much expectations, not too much negative views at the same time. Thank you.
Can I just add 1 minute to tell you an incident that happened which underlines John Bolton's point. So a big international treaty was being negotiated in Vienna around nuclear weapons. And there was a reception at the British Embassy, not related to the treaty itself. And at this reception were the ambassadors, amongst many others, the ambassadors from Ireland, Costa Rica, and New Zealand, all of them women, by the way. And they saw that the senior American was standing on his own, apart from the others. And so the three of them went up to him and began to argue that the Americans and others should really take these negotiations more seriously. And one of them said to him, "We represent over 120 countries." And his reply was, "Yes, but none of the ones that matter."
This is Mearsheimer. This is Mearsheimer, and this is Giordano Bruno again. So they are the winners so far. So I invite my good friend Rogério Studer to come and make his comments. Just a reminder, Ambassador Kamaru just reminded us, or no, suggested that the discussion should go back to maybe Bretton Woods and where it all began. I agree that this would be a very good move, especially because one of the key questions would be why the International Clearing House proposed by Keynes never took off. Why the Bancor, which was a very smart solution to the coordination among financial flows in the whole system, why the Bancor never took off? The answer is power. Power politics. Rogério.
Well, I have 10 minutes, right? 10 minutes? Let me start saying that perhaps because I'm sleep deprived, I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking about how pessimistic we end up being these days. I decided that I should share with you some of my views on how to be a hopeful pessimist. There's a wonderful writer in Brazil called Suassuna. He had a wonderful sense of humor. I recommend it to those who do not know him. But one way he was asked if he was a pessimist, he said, "Well, I can call myself a hopeful pessimist. I'm one of that kind." And people would say, "Well, this is easy. You've been married twice. You have 5 children. You have to be, hopeless." Hopeful person. But but I want to share a little bit of my experience that relates to G20 and why I'm much more optimistic than you are and why we should be that way. Economists are known for not being able to predict crises. There are 2 reasons for that. Some because we are trained beyond repair, and some of us because we have been trained but we do not see some of the events that are occurring that are leading to crisis. This is well known. And that was my impression in 2008. I was just arriving in the World Bank, and that was the largest global financial crisis ever. Because it began in North America, and North America had so many links, balance sheet links, with other countries that result a systemic risk beyond any proportion you can see.
At that time when I joined, I remember I was in a retreat, and our chief economist could be the chief economist of the IMF, and I'm going to mention the person, but because that's how economists, the World Bank thought, made a presentation to a retreat at the board, basically saying, this is just a, it's going to pass very quickly. And being myself a Minskian and looking at the data and the relations of balance sheet and how that was spreading, I said, I don't believe so. I think this is going to be a major crisis. And I was not saying because I was, unlike what you said, too smart. It was just I was looking at the numbers and saw it spreading. And also because I saw Hank Paulson go and beg to Pelosi, if you don't remember that, asking for the bailout of banks. And when I saw that, when I see the Secretary of Treasury begging to the opposition in Congress, yeah, his knees, saying, give me the money, you realize that this is collapsing. At that moment, the IMF and the World Bank, and I remember a colleague from the IMF, I like very much and respect very much, came to the embassy and said, no, this is, don't worry, we are taking care of it. So the reason I say that the distinctions between the incapacity of economists see crisis is that not only we cannot see crisis, but we have the tendency of, because you do not see crisis, you do not prepare yourself and present ideas for crisis management overcoming. Interestingly, what happened, it so happened that I was in the IMF when President Bush came inside and said, let's transform the G20 into a leaders forum. I saw that happening, which was a very awkward thing, but I can share with you. But truly what he was saying is that, and Paul Hank was the one insisting that had to be done, but he did not believe that it was necessary. He believed that the market would solve the problem. And said, no, we had to have a coordination, and what do we have? This is what we have. This is what we have. I mean, we did not have, I truly believe 5 minutes, I got 5 minutes, no, I got 6, I can tell here, I'm taking account. The point that I want to make is that even though the crisis happened, nobody was forecasting, there were several of us, including at the board of the World Bank, thinking around what would be the structure for dealing with crises like that. And a lot of the technocrats, I don't know who mentioned the technocrats, you mentioned the technocrats knew what to do. I mean, and they knew what to do in terms of responding quickly to the crisis. We also knew, and that's what I disagree, that including in the G20 was fundamental for moral and also for results, long-term results. But it would be impossible to get that kind of coordination in such a period of time in a large setting. We should have prepared for the forum to become more inclusive. But the truth is that the crisis was dealt with in the short run. The fiscal policies were mildly coordinated, which was necessary. It was coordinated. Let's push it. Even though all the economists were saying, no, we should not be expensive, everybody went to an expansion. Monetary policy was responded. Trade finance in the World Bank, everybody was saying we cannot expand the balance sheet of the World Bank. We doubled in 1 year. So what happened? We already knew that was possible, and the crisis was there, and it happened. Multilateral funding expanded. I just mentioned the World Bank, but you look at all others. Of course, the crisis, after the crisis was once you start quantitative easing, it was an easy way out of not dealing with that painful coordination. And that's what the United States did. Europe did that. Everybody else did that. Those that could do it just left everybody behind. So if there's one mistake in terms of the response to the crisis and the relation to G20 is that we did not prepare ourselves first to take forward this coordination, to anchor this somehow. Second, to work in a way that this would become more inclusive in the future, because only when it becomes inclusive, it becomes a global solution forum. Now, I want to jump, I still have 3 minutes. I want to jump to crisis now. We economists are not prepared to understand the next crisis. I can see it happening, and I can give you a bunch of, but the crises are not just economic. We're facing an inequality crisis of major proportions. Inequality is rising, and the consequences of that. I'm just going to mention 3 because otherwise it's. We're facing a major geopolitical crisis, and we're facing a climate emergency. I don't think that we have ever had an incredible crisis of that magnitude coming. And when I say coming, it's already happening. People are dying because of geopolitical tensions increasing. More than 128 wars happening today. People are dying. Climate is already killing people. People are suffering from climate change. And it's going to become, we had several discussions on that. I transformed myself into a climate, well, I wouldn't say expert, but knowledgeable, because I've been dealing with climate change for 15 years. But now it has become completely, the sense of acceleration is staggering even the scientists. And of course, people are dying because of exclusion. And this tension is becoming, when I say crisis, is when is this going to become a global crisis that affects everyone? How are we going to perceive that? You're going to perceive that when grandmas in Switzerland win a litigation against the state of Switzerland because they're not taking care of the climate change, and this is impact then. I think that we're going to pretty soon to see movements pressuring all governments in a larger scale to do transformation. And do we know how to do transformation? This is the main problem that we have. I think that, and I want to conclude here because I have 1 minute, but I would like to talk more about this at some other point. I think that we have to prepare ourselves to present solutions for deep transformation that leads to a more just, to an inclusive society, to a sustainable society. And this is, I promise you, this will be used because we know that the crises are turning around very quickly, and they will need solutions. So I welcome the Brazilian presidency attempt to bring 1,000 civil society abstracts to discuss this transformation, what is needed, what can be done, what are the tools. I welcome bringing the civil society and say, it's not enough, let's not talk about, with technocrats won't solve that. Civil society is going to start litigate us. They should. So I'll stop here just to say, as I started, I'm a hopeful pessimist. I think that we have the most incredible existential moment of civilization. I think we need solutions not coming from just the technocrats, and please, not from the economists, coming from civil society, coming from people in the communities, thinking outside of that, thinking about, 1 minute, just give me 1 minute. And I think this is the way Brazil should present itself in its presidency. This is, as we say in Portuguese, Brasil mostra sua cara. The Brazil show its face. Its face is a country that is critical for the solution of global crisis, not only climate inequality, but also geopolitical thing, showing the crisis, but also bringing to the table voices that can present the solution. So I'm a very, in a way, I'm more optimistic, but by being pessimistic. Thank you.
Rogério, you're not a qualified pessimist. You are super optimist. You're on the desire team. So we have the Mersheimer team, the Robert Waite team, and the Desires team. Okay, so I invite you, Anna, to have the honor to close the panel. Thank you.
It's a big responsibility after all those comments. So I am not of any of those teams. I am a Gramscian. So I will recall Gramsci's famous phrase, the pessimism of the reason and the optimism of the will. And why is that so important of all of your saying? Gramsci, as you know, an Italian communist leader who died in prison under fascism, he came out of the underdeveloped south of Italy, an agrarian south, and he went to the north of Italy, organizing labor movements, organizing workers in the Turin Fiat factories. And he was jailed. When he was in jail, he was famously known as the judge just said, well, we need to stop him from thinking. And he didn't stop thinking. The very opposite. He started to write his prison's notebooks and all these discussions around how did it happen. Because in front of him, in his time, he had a revolution in front of him. In his time, he was watching and witnessing how the Russians took the state and did a revolution out of the state, what he, from out of the First World War, he named the War of Maneuver. So take the state and do the revolution out there, from out there, and change society from a very underdeveloped Russia to a modernized technological Russia under the Soviet Union. And he said, we cannot do this in Italy, because in Italy we have such a strong civil society that is part of the extended state, that is so powerful because it has business power, because it has churches, it has ideologies, it has many strong ideological civil society groups, and economically strong civil society groups, the whole business organizations of that time. That it won't work if you just take the state as a push, as a coup d'etat. We need to do the revolution from below up, from bottom up. So we need a war of position, as I don't know if that's the right translation to English. I didn't plan to talk about Gramsci here, but as you were all talking about pessimism and what to see in this future, what I think is important to mention after all those very precious and very important comments before me is that the creation of the G7 back in the 70s was a very important move to reassure, to reinforce US power. It was the reinforcement of US hegemony in the 1970s. And the creation of the G20 in the end of the 1990s was also a move by the United States, as it very clearly stated. I really liked reading this wonderful paper. To try to manage a capitalist crisis, to turn back capitalism in good functioning, well functioning. What does that mean? Does that mean that we have to stay, like we have to change to stay the same in the end? But it turned out that the creation of the G20 and then the 2008 crisis showed actually a sign of relatively decline of US hegemony, relatively, and the power politics that you were just mentioning before, so that the G20 is, in the end, in my view, an expression of those geopolitical tensions. It won't resolve them at all, but it expresses them. And the issue of representativeness and the legitimacy, I would separate two things. One is the representation of stakeholders, actors, and the proposal of this economic council will improve that very well. But the other is the expansion of the agenda. Everything now seems to fit into the G20, and that is good and bad at the same time. I think it has a lack of focus because it won't solve everything. There is this huge expectation that makes us sound so optimistic, even though we're not. In Brazil, I think we're very influenced by that. If you were 2-3 years ago, we wouldn't be as optimistic, we know. we are now so much willing and we put so much expectation in the G20 because we're now under a different, little better political situation. But the thing is, everything seems to fit in the G20, and it makes it less effective. So the expansion of the agenda from the financial stability and the financial rules to everything possible makes things much, much harder. And in the end, and I don't know how much time I have, what counts is the balance of forces. Not only the balance of powers, the great powers, but the balance of forces from society. And I recall Gramsci because he was in prisons very, very negatively seeing why did they lose the revolution in Italy? How come the Russians did it and not in Italy or not Western Europe? Because not only Italy, we remember Germany right after the First World War tried the revolution, it was completely shut down. The balance of forces can really push forward some agendas and can put downwards others. The balance of forces can move things forward in some directions instead of others. And I might sound strange here, but it doesn't really change many things if we have a lot of representation of the Global South and Africa on the table. If the balance of forces in the agenda doesn't change, we can bail out banks, we can protect the wealth of the very rich, with some representatives of the elites in the Global South at the table. It won't change the agenda. What we have to is to fight or to struggle or to try to push for a new balance of forces in all those multilateral spaces. You said very well in the paper, you quoted, I think, someone, I don't recall it, that the G20 was actually a space of consensus building for the G7's ideas. And this is key. Are we discussing the G7's ideas so the balance of forces are towards the main agendas of these countries and their finance sectors and their main industrial sectors? Or are we changing this to another direction? So I think that the agenda is the main issue. I don't know how much time I have. Thank you.
Okay, so let me thank Robert and the discussants, the panelists, and with this we close this session. And I'm very proud to say that we're only 5 minutes late, so that's the win. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Okay, Ian, are you here? Are you online? Ian, could you put him? Okay. Ele está? So Ian, yes, you're here. Hello. Hi, Ian.
Yep.
Can you hear us?
Okay, we're getting feedback now on the audio.
Yeah, some feedback. I don't know what to do about the feedback. I don't know. So let's restart. That's the last session. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alexandre Guambidi. I'm from the National School for Public Administration. It's a pleasure being here as a moderator of the session. Thanks to Ana Célia Castro for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. And the panel title is the second session about the challenges, constraints, and possibilities for the G20 futures. And you have the privilege of having 5 bright guests. And so they told me to start with Jan Kregel. He's a professor for Tallinn University of Technology. The editor of Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. Thank you for being with us, Jan. So you have 10 minutes for your presentation, so it will follow by the other guests that will comment and making their considerations. So thank you very much.
Okay, I'm ready to go. I'll try to keep it to 10. We'll start out by picking up this idea of things that are sinking without trace. We'll note that the Titanic has been found, and people can look at it and rescue pieces from it. And I note that we're still getting a little feedback on the audio, at least on my side. So if you can try and correct that on your side, it would be helpful. Now, the first point that I want to make is that the G20 and all of this stuff started out in terms of reform of the international financial architecture, not the governance architecture. And this is true from Bretton Woods onwards. The Bretton Woods Conference took place before the United Nations Charter was signed, before there was even an idea that you were going to have a UN Charter signed in San Francisco. So that's, I think we have to keep in mind, is that the governance structure is going to be determined by the change in the financial structure and not vice versa. Now, if you look at the development of the United Nations and the aspect of financial architecture, in the beginning, the financial crisis of 97-99, which was the Asian crisis that we've talked about, was born when the Clinton administration and the president himself announced that the U.S. was in favor of a reform of the international financial architecture. This led to the UN Financing for Development Conference in Monterrey. Unfortunately, I was an active participant representing developing countries and UNCTAD in the UN, and this gives me a great disadvantage in terms of evaluating the prospects for these sorts of proposals, because Monterrey, yes, did sink without a trace. The 2007 and 2008 crisis produced a report of a commission of experts of the President of the United Nations, Robert has referenced this report and also suggested that it has sunk without a trace. Well, this may be true, but like the Titanic, there may be some things which are relevant to recover from the wreckage of that report. Now, if we look at the proposal that Robert has made, that proposal is, I would like to say, all form and no content. Let's go back to the Titanic, rearranging the deck chairs. And I would argue that the problem is that his proposal has virtually no content at all, and virtually no content in what exactly his governance council is going to do. Now, the advantage of the UN report, which I am not going to defend or propose, I'm simply going to note its existence, is that it did recommend a global economic coordination council, but within the United Nations, not within the IMF or any existing multilateral institution, because of the difficulties that we have been subject to in receiving any sort of democratic representation. Robert talked about Hamilton. Well, Hamilton was fine, but if you look at the history of the creation of the US Constitution, this was Hamilton versus Jefferson. And unfortunately, Robert has left Jefferson out of his discussion. Jefferson is what? Jefferson is the General Assembly within the United Nations, where every person gets one vote. And the result of this in the United States was a constitution, not a coordination council. It was a set of institutions, not simply setting up a commission. The most important part of that proposal was the intermediate step, an international panel of experts that had tasks, and it was supposed to provide what Rogerio Stewart has already mentioned, a forward-looking analysis of the problems that might be achieved. Now, this is all absent in the proposal that Robert has made. Will it be included or not? We really don't know. Now, if we look at what occurred after 1971 in the international financial non-system using Robert Triffin's nomenclature, Alan Greenspan noted that what used to be current account crises and exchange rate crises had become capital account crises. That is, that the external constraint represented by stable exchange rates and the accumulation of foreign exchange reserves no longer held, because private financial flows could now cover any external deficits without any conditionality or without any IMF program. It was private capital flows that funded the external deficit. And those private capital flows were enabled by our friend, the Washington Consensus. Now, we now know the Washington Consensus has failed. We know that it has produced financial crises ad interim throughout the period of the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010, and so on and so forth. So if we're going to be talking about reform, the reform is to reform that non-system. And that reform of the non-system is what? The reform of the non-system is not so much the power of the U.S. as a nation or a government or the U.S. dollar, and I'll use here the Goldman Sachs nomenclature. It's the power of U.S. financial institutions. It's global private financial institutions that have replaced the pre-1970s IMF and international financial architecture. And the question is, how are we going to provide regulation of those global financial institutions? Article 4 surveillance of the IMF no longer has any agency or sanction. The idea that the use of Article 6 could be used to control international capital flows has been consistently refused. The idea of a sovereign debt resolution mechanism within the IMF has been rejected. The creation of multiple agencies, the BIF, SSB, and so on and so forth, has created employment for many of my colleagues dealing with financial issues, but, well, they didn't sink without a trace, but they have had absolutely zero impact on the impact of financial flows in determining debt crisis, in determining financial crisis. So if we're going to talk about governance reform, we have to talk about financial reform. And the basic problems that we're looking at here is the fact that financial is global. Corporations are global. Information is global. All of our basic policy problems are global, but none of them are subject to regulation because there is no agency, there is no sanction. Okay? Now, if we look at the problems that we have in front of us, the basic problems, I would argue, is also the fact that the problems we have are not global in the sense that climate change does not respect national frontiers. Climate change is nonlinear. It's non-reversible. Okay? The thing that strikes me about responding to the climate change is to say, well, we have to fix the temperature. We have to stop the use of carbon. Well, that's not the problem. The ice is not going to go back to Greenland. The storms are not going to stop. The droughts will not be reversed. The beaches will not be recovered. Human settlements will not become habitable. We have a problem of global human migration and redistribution of production, which is now the main problem. This is more than just carbon abatement. Okay? We have agricultural units that will no longer be possible to persist producing the wherewithal, the food security that the moving populations will need. And the problem we have to do is to how to provide that transitional and that relocation support in terms of identifying the system. The problem that we have is what I would call a global maldistribution of fiscal space. Developed countries can always use their traditional fiscal measures. If people use their houses in Florida, the US government can bail them out, rebuild the houses, and move them. Developing countries don't have this possibility. They don't have the technical expertise, and they don't have the financial space. Where are they going to get that financial space? It's going to come from borrowing. And it means that they're going to have increasing indebtedness. Indebtedness, which I would argue has really no counterparty. That is something which is never going to be repaid. And we have to remember, again, quoting Abba Lerner, repayment of foreign currency debt constitutes a real burden on the country, just as borrowing provided a real benefit, quite different from any benefit that can accrue from internal borrowing. So we have this contradistinction. The developed countries can use internal borrowing, the developing countries have to use external borrowing, which means a real burden on their countries. And the problem is, how are we going to resolve that problem? How do we replace or resolve that differential burden in terms of responding to the problems that we have? Now, there are proposals that date from, and I'm going to argue here, they come from the Titanic of the original clearing proposals. There are amendments to Keynes' original proposal, proposed by Schumacher, Kalecki, Balog, and a number of other economists, that provide for multilateral clearing of national financial balances, automatic investment decisions taken in order to produce and finance sustainability measures for developing countries that would provide for the relocation of displaced populations. Remember, Keynes had talked about commod control, the control of specialized primary inputs for sustainable investments. Schumacher's proposal also allows the retention of national currencies. We don't have to abolish national currencies, but it's a system that doesn't require a global currency. Now, this may sound like fantascienza, but if you think about it, and if we investigate these proposals once again, we will discover that they may be adequate to providing for the new financial architecture. Now, my point of optimism comes here, and that is that there is already in existence a number of private sector clearing systems that were patterned on Keynes' clearing proposal, and they are functional. That is, it's not a technological problem. The advances that we have in terms of technology would allow the introduction of a Keynesian clearing mechanism in which the developed countries who have the benefit of domestic financing would automatically provide the financing to developing countries that don't have that advantage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kriegel, for your insightful presentation. So according to the list I received, Maria Elizabeth, no, Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. 10 minutes, please.
Right, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everybody from Johannesburg. Meet you. And I have to say, I have to apologize at the outset that I haven't been able to listen in on the earlier ones. I just got a little bit the tail end of it, but it seems that it's been really very, very substantial. Let me start by saying that my approach will be to look at the forum of the G20 as a potential improved locus of moving forward on some of these challenges. And at the beginning, let me say that I think we're at a particularly critical point that requires really significant rethinking of the models, of the architecture. I think all the points that Jan has emphasized and some of the points that I caught at the end of the session before tea, I think these are all very, very important. But they're also extremely difficult at this particular juncture that we're sitting in terms of the geopolitics of it. I'm not an economist, so I'm going to come at it from an international relations perspective, but make the point, of course, that I think getting ideas on the table now in terms of the global discussion, the point that was made in the paper earlier, I think is very important, even if we can't get to a point where we can make decisions because we are so polarized. So that's the first point. But we also need a halfway station, so to speak, because, I mean, the points that have been raised just now and in the earlier session are absolutely significant and transformational and important that we engage on, but we need to sort of identify what that roadmap might be in terms of getting us to that ideal future. So we know that the G20 posits itself as the premier forum on global economic governance. We know that it has fallen really, really short. We know at one level that its input legitimacy is flawed. It did a reasonable job, one can argue, although I suspect there will be differences of opinion in terms of how it managed the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Some might argue that confers on it some output legitimacy. In subsequent years, it has felt that it's been important because of this legitimacy deficit, partially to think also about development in its agenda. This has also been a challenge in the context of an expanded agenda that we heard about a little earlier, and that is, I think, an issue that we need to engage with. But it's brought on development and its various dimensions, which have a very clear overlap with a lot of the conversations that we're having now around global financial architecture. If we're talking about debt, if we're thinking about the way in which the IMF and the World Bank are organized and governed, and the global private financial system, there are clearly overlaps with the development agenda there. But that was a recognition that if we're talking about global financial stability, we also need to think about those other countries in the developing world, because what happens there also impacts on what happens to us. And I suppose at one level, the admission of the AU, with all its challenges, and we can talk about that later, last year, I think was also an attempt at dealing with some of these input legitimacy issues. I think in the last couple of years, though, even if we recognize that the G20 has been some sort of bridging forum where, you know, different camps come together, I think it has been challenged by the very, very fraught, increasingly fraught geopolitical environment. It has survived, though, and we can say, well, it's kind of, you know, struggling to keep its head afloat. But I think it probably would have been more difficult if we didn't have developing countries that were chairing the processes over the last couple of years to make sure that certain things get onto the agenda and actually some things are driven forward. And just to give one example, perhaps, is really the issue around multilateral development reform. It's not to say we have resolved this, but it's on the agenda and it's being driven forward. It's also been driven forward by Brazil. And I think in that regard, the real social dimensions that Brazil is bringing to the agenda in the G20, I think are very important. I'm going to come back to that just now. Really, it is a diverse grouping. I think the point that was made right at the end of the previous session, does the G20 become a forum where the G7 gets to legitimate its decisions, I think is a very important point. And I think certainly there has been historically an element of that. But I would argue that over the last several years, I think the ability of developing countries in the G20, global South countries in G20, to really articulate much more forcefully a positive agenda for change, I think is a characteristic. It's not where it should be yet, but I think we're seeing much more of that. What we need to see more of course, is better and more effective coordination among that grouping. We're currently in a polarized world where cooperation between great powers is a problem. It's seen in zero-sum terms. Giving concessions or agreeing to new ideas is seen as, depending on where the idea comes from, supporting one or another side. And that has all contributed to this multilateral system that is largely paralyzed. So the question then, really in the context of the G20, is how do groupings that are not homogenous, like the G20 as opposed to the G7, operate effectively in a fraught geopolitical period when agreement in the formal institutions or to change the formal institutions becomes so difficult? Can they play a role that avoids complete paralysis, or at least allows for a degree of coordination on some issues? And I think it's also fair to say that global cooperation hasn't completely disappeared. I think it's taken on different forms. There's some regional cooperation. There is cooperation on particular issues, so sectoral, thematic cooperation. There's absolutely growing pluralism and no uniformity, no harmonization or no full harmonization, and of course, nothing that approaches universalism. But that's the environment, and things are. I'd like to put a positive spin on things, although sometimes these days I feel quite depressed. But we haven't obviated cooperation completely. It's just taken on different forms because of the paralysis at the global level. I think it is useful to reflect a little bit on what Amitav Acharya has called the multiplex world, because I think that is, to a large extent, what we're facing. And in a recent article in International Affairs, he and a few other authors talked about us needing to look at the interaction capacity among states, or the relative ability of nations to exercise leadership and organize cooperation. And that really tells us the extent to which there is an order or a disorder in the world. And the outcome of that was that things are not as bad as they perhaps look, albeit imperfect. And so in that regard, I think the G20 can be one of a number of instruments in the immediate term that can help cooperation, keep dialogue open, play the role of a bridge to build consensus and critically trust. Because if we're wanting to change the system and transform it deeply, we need to rebuild trust. And we need to rebuild trust initially in small pockets. And this is, I think, where many countries in the global South can really play a positive role in the leadership positions that they have assumed over the last couple of years. And many of these global South countries are also what we would call, certainly some academics here in South Africa, call emerging middle powers, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia. For the first time in a long time, I think we have countries who are in a position to exert significant influence and shape the narrative and try to drive, to build a consensus. And this should not be scoffed at. These are countries with independent foreign policies. They do pursue their national interests, and that's important, but they're also fundamentally committed to global cooperation and multilateralism, recognizing that the current system is in serious need of an overhaul. And there I want to raise a couple of points, building on some of the observations made earlier. One of the biggest challenges in shifting from a G7 to a G20 was exactly that, the fact that the knowledge institutions that supported that grouping and the new grouping continued to be the same. So when you have the sort of knowledge, the paradigms sort of emanating from the same institutions from which they emanated when we only had a G7, the likelihood of something different is probably quite marginal. But I think this is now beginning to change. But one of the biggest opportunities that we have in terms of beginning to shift the thinking, the narrative, the agenda, the debate, is the opportunities created by the Think 20 discussion in Brazil, and there have been a number of discussions in India last year, hopefully next year with South Africa, where you're having many think tank knowledge institutions in these countries really really pushing themselves forward in terms of new thinking and new ideas focused specifically on development and the social agenda, and how the global financial system interacts with that. And I think this is really an opportunity to create global South knowledge institutions that can build off each other in order to really push through new narratives, new thinking, new paradigms on these transformational issues. And I think in that sense, and here perhaps I'll end, is the G20, for all its flaws, can become, from a global South perspective, an instrument that seeks to build cooperation, change the narratives, and really begin the process to transform the thinking about the kind of global governance, global financial governance, but more broadly global governance architecture that we require. It's not going to happen overnight, I think, but it's important to keep the ideas on the table, and let's look at what avenues and platforms are there that we can use constructively to begin changing that dialogue. And here I also think that the social summit that Brazil is organizing at the end of the year creates another such opportunity for many of these issues and intersectionality with them to be engaged on, for us to engage with them. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Now, I would like to invite for comments Maria João Rodrigues. She is the president of Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Thank you very much. And you have 10 minutes, Maria João.
Very well. I suppose that I can start.
Yes. Can you hear us?
I'm assuming this is the case. So I'm the president of a foundation located in Brussels. Name is FAPS, Foundation for European Progressive Studies. And our role is to support the European Union institutions when defining key policies.
Can you hear us?
I suppose that I can move ahead.
Yes, you have.
I'd like to greet this very important topic for discussion. I read in detail the paper by Professor Wade and Westergaard. And I'd like to tell you what are the thoughts of progressive thinkers and policymakers in the European Union about exactly this topic. First of all, I think this is very timely because we are close to an important United Nations summit, the Summit of the Future, which is supposed to discuss exactly about this. What kind of reform of global governance should we have also to deal with the issues of economic governance, global economic governance? And this comes at a time where United Nations needs to make a serious update to cope with the current world, new challenges, and also, in fact, a multipolar world. We have received proposals which have the same purpose, somehow similar proposals, but all in all, what I want to say is that this kind of reform, similar to create a global economic council, is really necessary. We understand this very well when we see the difficulties to implement properly the Sustainable and Development Goals agenda. As we know, this agenda is confronted with really a kind of backtracking and many differences across countries in the world. And one of the reasons for this is that we don't have a real process to implement SDGs. From my viewpoint, this process should count on real strategic national plans for each country, adapted to the needs of each country, and then supported by stronger global instruments when it comes sharing technology, new scientific solutions, open way to deal with trade as a leverage for development, and most of all, important reform of the financial architecture. So these global conditions should be there to support countries when they make their effort to implement SDGs. And this is not happening so far. So we really need a big reform, and top-level body in the United Nations should have this in its hands. Then, when it comes to the composition, this is a very tricky issue, and I saw the paper discussing this in detail. I would like to emphasize that a composition able to combine at the same time effectiveness and legitimacy should give a strong role to the so-called regional organizations, such as the European Union, the African Union, hopefully a similar organization in Latin America or South America, and the same, for instance, for ASEAN in Asia. Let me refer that when preparing the Summit of the Future, now there is a big discussion on whether is this enough just to strengthen the role of ECOSOC, or should we really create a new body such as the one suggested by this paper, a Global Economic Council? I would prefer to have a second choice, and that's why I think this paper and this discussion is so relevant. Then I'd like to make a final point regarding the interplay with G20. Because, first of all, from my viewpoint, the G20 as an informal gathering, an informal forum, is certainly much more representative and interesting regarding the so-called G7. I'd like to start to make this point. Then I also believe that there are two ways to use the G20. The G20 can be used to undermine the multilateral system, but the G20 can also be used to support the reform of the multilateral system. And so I think this should be the second way we should discuss about. I really believe that, coming back to my initial proposal to organize a real process to implement SDGs, we should have all the relevant United Nations agencies. We should have a stronger drive on IMF, World Bank, and the multilateral development banks. But exactly because of this, I think the G20, if this is properly handled, can help, can play a positive role. And so this is my suggestion to the Brazilian colleagues who have now such an important responsibility to make the best of this G20. So this is my comment. I apologize that I cannot go on with you right now because I'm supposed to close another conference with people from all over Europe, but you can count on me for our joint work to make the best of the G20 chaired by Brazil. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope the sound was okay.
Thank you very much for your comments and for your effort to be with us for this time. So the next discussant is the Professor Abu Mozi. Thank you, Professor. If you'd like to come, he's in person. And Professor Abu Mozi, he's the Director of Research Strategy and Innovation of the Economic Research Institute for Asian and East Asia. Professor, you have 10 minutes for your comments.
I'm the last person?
No, you have one more.
Okay, thank you very much, and it is my pleasure to be the part of this closing panel. And the challenge for a person in the panel is you need to agree for everything with what you said. Because all this presentation of the bright ideas we have been discussing morning is kind of directing us to think about the future. But I'm from India, and I'm based in Jakarta, Indonesia, and working for a regional institute that is funded by Japan. So that region, but it's Asia Pacific, houses 6 G20 economies. So what I am going to say is more about the collective thinking of these 6 G20 economies, both in the north and the south. So I would like to make on 3 points, and one is about the relevance and the future of G20. The second is about how Brazil can make a difference. And third one is being a think tank, academia, what we can do. And one thing on the relevance of G20, and we all know the history of the G20, and the global governance architecture evolves, or it emerges when there is a crisis. And this crisis happened, this multiple crises, this financial, food and fuel crisis happened in 2008. Then this G20 invented, and it was we need to appreciate Obama and President Obama when what was it was very much linked to the Lehman Brothers crisis. So there is the lenders in the global north, and most of these borrowers are from the emerging economies. They know that is only the lenders cannot solve this problem, and they looked into this architecture where there is bringing in the emerging economies. And it was a kind of ad hoc process, and they find this G20. But there is a merit on it, and basically at that time, 2008, everybody is not looking for is not a kind of a new architecture, but a policy coordination. There is a macroeconomic policy coordination. So we need to appreciate that the G20 was able to contain the policy. This is financial crisis. But what happened after that? And basically, it has expanded. Previously, the financial sector, that is only the financial ministers meeting, has been expanded to include the energy, which is close to the climate change, and then food security, and then now it is almost about 13 working groups, ministerial working groups. So here it has been expanded from a governance, this economic governance architecture into a kind of architecture that covers the global prosperity. Whether that is needed. Now I think it has been expanded. I think, in my opinion, they have been expanded too fast and too much. Maybe it may be a time to think whether we need to come back to these economic issues or continue to expand. And this, we don't have the solutions. But one thing happened, and this global governance architecture, this is the G7. G8 is the kind of a default custodian of the global governance architecture. So they control everything. And in the initial stage, it was used, this G20 was used as a platform. But later, I think it has been differing architecture. And there is an opinion divisions that happen within the G20. But also, you need to say, like a country like Indonesia and India, they didn't have the space in the G8 or the G7. But they wanted to be identified as a part of the club, elite club, that is looking after the global matters. So they feel it, and becoming a member of the G20 group, there is an elite group. It gives them the space, and also it kind of gives them kind of an artificial pride. That is, they are becoming a part of their influential global group. But indeed, it is not. And global for G20 remain as a kind of a forum to discuss the issues and find policy coordination rather than setting the new rules or implementing the governance architecture. So this is the one that is we need to think about it, and whether we need to look back into the global governance architecture as a G20, or it need to be expanded to include. And there is a critical moment, and we need to make a decision. We don't have the simple organization. One solution is the GEC that has been proposed in the Pactor. But we need to make sure that if this GEC comes in, and it cannot become another UN organization where you have all the countries speaks, but very hard to make any decision or any implementable decisions. It becomes a kind of another charting club of UN organization. We need to make sure that become efficient and effective in bringing the global economic coordination. My second question is, or the second point is what could be the relative advantage for the Brazil? The G20 has innovated this trioca. There is a past president, and there is a present, and there is a future. This innovation helps to bring the continuity of what is made in the previous presidency, and then take it back to the next one. And in this regard, basically, if you look into these G20 presidencies of the past behavior, you can see that is the kind of a pattern, and most of these presidencies reacted to the global crisis. So, for example, in Germany 2017, and they focused this migration. They brought this cross-border migration as an issue to be discussed. The second, in 2000, Indonesia president is a pandemic, and so here, what could be the advantage for the Brazil? Now, this is relatively there is no crisis, but one thing is we need to see there is many agreements and that has been agreed on, and what Brazil can bring is a kind of urgency to the issues that has been already discussed. I think it has been the first panel also, they showed there is a global There is a debt issues. There is a public debt issues that need a macroeconomic coordination. Second is the climate crisis that need one is on the mitigation side, and we need an energy transition in a peaceful and in a inclusive way. And third one is the digital transformation that is happening at a speed which is very expansive and very exponential, but we don't have the kind of architecture, global architecture, to govern it. But emerging architectures are all built or designed in northern hemisphere, I think the global north. So what will be the wise? And here I think Brazil can bring in kind of a concrete ideas, proposals as a support of accelerating the actions that has been already agreed on. The third point is we are academic. So we have our own limitations. I have been following this G20 since Korea, the 2010 presidencyship. I used to interact with the Sherpas. But when we see when we about the think tank and when we talk to the Sherpas, they look at us in a different view. And they say, okay, you are good ideas, very bold ideas, but these are not practical. They blame us. And this is where I think we need to bring bright ideas and also some pragmatism to the discussions. So I propose maybe 3 areas where that is the Brazil think tank 20 can look into it. One is look into this kind of regional networks, and there is a sub-regional networks. It happened that the African Union is now already part of it, and you have the Latin America. In Asia, we have network. So make it this think tank as a kind of an inclusive process of including the small and medium-sized economies. Their perceptions could be reflected by the think tanks. So let us make it a very inclusive process looking at the sub-regional cooperation. And second thing is, that is the beauty of G20. And this year, last year it was India, and this is Brazil. And that we don't have that institutional memory. And second thing is G20 doesn't have that kind of permanent secretariat. So we can develop as a B20 Brazil, T20 Brazil can think about kind of a de facto secretariat. Not for organizing the meeting, but researching on whether these declarations has been following. What was the follow-up for the statement that is made at the summit level? We can these 20 think tank groups can create a dashboard where how this pledges has been followed up. Whether we don't have the compliance mechanism, but we can. It can be an academic exercise or developing a dashboard where everyone can be reporting it. That could be a kind of learning for the other developing countries also. So look into what are the best practices, what are the innovations happen. And third suggestion is, and we are blamed for a kind of an elite group of bright ideas. But we need to be pragmatic also. I think that is we have been discussing during the coffee break, and probably I think T20 could look into what's happening in the B20. And there are several engagement groups, but maybe 2 may be, from my observation, I may be wrong, but 2 may be much more bring the rationality. One is the B20, the business 20. They have a great influence on the government G20 group, official working groups. They listen, government listens when the B20 says. And we are bright and they can moderate our thinking to bring to the pragmatism. So we can communicate with the B20 group. And another one is the Y20. I think young 20, they are the future, and we may be obsolete in our thinking. And we know at the age of, I'm 56, and I'm at the age of, my thinking is very much constrained by the past experiences. I don't want to do this, but these young people, and they have a bright ideas, they have a vision for the future. So we, T20, can bring them, and what will be the bright ideas that is we missed. So we can make it and we can reflect it in our communique, and that could be submitted. And second thing, we make conversations how far we are idealistic and pragmatic to the ideas that is we generate collectively. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ambubosi, for your comments. So last but not least, I would like to invite Paulo Protásio for his comments. And Paulo Protásio is from the Sustainable Development Authority from Rio de Janeiro. If you want to speak. Se quiser falar.
Para ameaçar a todos, eu não vou nem ao palco, porque assim fica mais rápido. A minha intervenção vem muito na direção que o professor fez. My proposal here is much more related to what you said, and to what Karamuru also is teaching and making everybody know the past, the present, and the future. My suggestion is that we need to use Brazil to another step in the change process. The process is on. You cannot stop it. It is going to happen anyway. Okay? But what to do is, in my point of view, is to look better our worldwide relationship. To make this happen, Brazil has yesterday, and all of you are invited to go to one house here in the beach where we call Casa G20, the G20 house. You are invited to go there and look for a little small expo on world maps. Yesterday, the giant of our database, IBGE, has announced a new world map for Brazil. I'm going to give you the address and I'm going to take you there. The most important thing is the change is in our mind. For 200 years, Brazil has studied in its every school a world map center in Europe. So we are Eurocentrists. You cannot change that. More, Brazil is Atlantic, is not bioceanic. And the ocean is one, is not two. We are a member of a continent, and we are not an island in the continent. And we need to change that. That is the first proposal of the Brazilian approach to the G20 in Brazil. It's a new view from our side to your side in a worldwide basis, and the same thing from your side to our side. So this is the first move. The second move is we want to go into the third avenue. Not stay on the first. It's good what you're doing. The government is getting together. Yesterday here we were discussing energy. We were discussing here health. And in the other room we were discussing agriculture. In every room that we were discussing, Brazil was a player. And it's a big player. More than that, we can really achieve the difference going to the work done before. Can we show the little step that we did? When the governor of Rio became the state, host state there, the first thing we did was to go to India, book everything that they have done in this time frame that they have worked very well, brought into Brazil, asked to the government of India to give to the government of state government, we're talking about a sub-government, with state government of Rio de Janeiro, what are the accomplishments that was done there. This is taken out from the table of our governor. We gave him this. What he did, he created what we call the Authority of Sustainable Development for the state of Rio de Janeiro. What is our task, Professor? Our task is bring all the papers into action and bring those into the municipalities. And we have 92 municipalities. From June on, up to the end of this period, we're going to put on in all municipalities the most important targets that were selected by the global effort done in India. So we're going to go to action. My friend Anna says, let's create a new way of doing things. It's call for action. So now it's time to act. And we are offering this to other states. We have in Brazil a G7 group. I don't know if you know that. The G7 group is formed by the South and Southeast states. The governors meet every 90 days for 3 days. They bring all the staff that they have, health, agriculture, etc., 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 more than we want. But they work together. And guess what happened? G20 is in 7 states, led by the 7 governors, talking about putting together Atlantic and Pacific. We're going to redesign the South America relationship with the G20. 60% of our business and change and exchanges in Pacific, 40% in Atlantic now. So what we want to suggest is the T20 Brazil, at the moment that we are heading to a change process, just host this. Host this talking to 1,000? Imagine that. 1,000 abstracts. Imagine if we go and take this spark into this ambience. We bring professors. Anna is with me. We are now talking about 27 universities in the COSUD, that is the Consórcio Sul-Sudeste, with the governors. We're talking about how we can implement together the basic stuff that was brought in and done during the period of India. We are tomorrow deciding how we're going to be the best meeting in São Paulo, not in Rio, because São Paulo said, I want also bring some of our municipalities. Unfortunately, São Paulo has many. So we're going to host on 14, 15 of May, 365 municipalities in São Paulo talking about the same thing. It's bigger than Argentina. So basically what we want is not a miracle. What we want is to dip in on the same line that your presentation. is to make that happen, to make it such a thing that we can also make it such a third, a fourth, a fifth step in the future. So my point of view, just finishing, is if you open, you said that the B20, if you open the book of B20, you cannot do, you can accomplish what he said you must do. It's too much. If we don't do now, we lose. In every month that goes on, more loss. The distance of the world, global one, that was discussing India in our room at the agriculture discussion was enormous. We decided to continue the discussion. Now, in end of July, we're going to host a big meeting, Brazil meeting, discussing what is in the frame of the agriculture process bought in, created in India. For one day, including the entire team, the people that was there of G20, and more than that, other institutions. We don't going to leave anyone aside. So that is the proposal, and that is only one thought. Just say yes, and we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulo. I would like to express my gratitude for all of you that attending this panel. So I'd like to invite Ana Célia and Rogério Studert for the final session.
Yes, but just for questions, no? Just if you want to make questions. So the floor is open to you, and comments and etc. And also for people who is in the Zoom session, okay? Yeah. Gilson Schwartz. Gilson.
Thank you. Okay. I'll use my notes here. My name is Gilson Schwartz. I am an associate professor at the University of São Paulo, working at the School of Communication and Arts and the Faculty of Philosophy, Literature, and Human Sciences. And my background is in economics, PhD in economics, and been teaching economics for more than 40 years. But when the internet arrived, I was then a chief economist at Bank Boston, Brazil, and the president of the bank was also the president of the American Chamber of Commerce. This was '94. So one of the main channels for introducing the internet in Brazil was the American Chamber of Commerce. I was there. That changed my life. So I quit my jobs as economist, professor of economics and all that, and I decided to start a new professional career focusing on the internet. So it's really astonishing, and I'm so thankful to be here these days. Thank you, Professor Ana Célia, for giving me the chance to catch up with all these discussions. But I'm still astonished by the sheer fact that almost no one mentioned this little word, the internet, the digital transformation. It's a poly-crisis, but it's also poly-opportunities. And the main technological drive is the digitalization of society. So how does this enormous civilizational change affect the G20, affect the geopolitics of innovation, participation, So I think that we are still falling behind, and Brazil especially has been, let's say, fortunate in certain areas of digital development, but very, very, very unfortunate in terms of public policies for digital inclusion, the so-called digital gap, digital inclusion. The privatization of the telecom sector here has as one of its effects the absolute inexistence of digital inclusion policies, except, of course, for collecting taxes. One of the most efficient systems in the world for collecting taxes. We have now, not only that, the banking system, of course, at the avant-garde of the SWIFT, interesting name, the SWIFT mechanism in Brazil. So I think that we are still lagging behind in our discussion of the relationships between the digital transformation in information and communication technologies into a new public sphere, a new citizenship. We're still lagging behind. I think that a few keywords that were expressed here, especially today, the bottom-up approach, the Gramscian approach, that's interesting. Gramsci writing from the prison. One of the main works written by Gramsci in the prison is called The City. The City. So, much before the internet, Gramsci was thinking about a bottom-up practice that engaged communication strategies, embraced cultural hegemony as a key factor, and we're still lagging behind in discussing this new public city sphere, a new publicity, a new public sphere that can be really built up from the bottom of society, but that requires public policies that engage with the emergence of this new culture, the youth, the utopias. What is the connection that we have? I'm 64 now. I've been working on this for the last 25 years. It's so hard to be just, heard by not only the economists, of course. So I think that the bottom-up perspective is not just a political or ideological proposition. I will make it shorter. It's really an opportunity to create more participatory and evolutionary deliberation processes. I agree that many forms can be designed, but what is the participatory content? What are the creative currencies that will lead us into decarbonization, into new health practices, new food consumption practices? So I think that we can actually build new currencies, social currencies. Brazil is a very important example in the area of social currencies. Why digital currencies are not so much developed here? What's the role of the youth and their patterns of consumption of digital content? Of course, telecoms were privatized, but I still think there is a lot of room for us to build up on the technological transformation, the digital transformation that's going on. We can create maybe a new IMF out of these new infrastructures. It depends on going bottom-up rather than top-bottom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jan, the floor is yours. I have the impression that you would like to give answers to all the comments. Maybe you want to intervene now. The floor is yours.
Oh, okay. I was not expecting this. The first thing I would like to remind Jilson, perhaps he missed the end of my presentation, which provided the digital equivalent of Keynes' clearing proposal. So we have not ignored the. Now, in terms of social currencies, that's a different story, and I don't think that quite enters into the discussion that we're having here. Two things that I wanted to mention in the presentation, which I sort of forgot because of the time constraint. The first is that going back to the original financing for development proposal, that this was the result. I mentioned the support given by the US administration, but the original proposal came from Brazil. And it was a Brazilian second secretary some 20 years before, if memory serves me right, that originally made the proposal for this Financing for Development conference. And it took some 20 years until the thing actually came to fruition, which gives us some idea of the time which is involved in getting these things to function. The second is that the idea of democratic participation in international financial institutions was the subject of what, from my point of view, very successful research group that was organized by Fernando Cardim and myself with the support of the Ford Foundation program that Leonardo mentioned earlier, and was probably a front runner in this discussion of what we called at that stage democratic participation. So it went some range beyond the kinds of simple rearrangement of the deck chairs that Robert has talked about in terms of providing a more representative representation of the G20 proposal. Now, as I've said before, the fact that all of these things have taken a great deal of time to produce and have had very little impact does give us some pause for thought. As I say, I do not have a very optimistic outlook in terms of the presentation. And in terms of the idea that was brought up at the end of having individual groupings dealing with individual issues, strikes me as not really totally relevant in the present case. Why is that? Well, the point is that as things become more global and as things become more technologically linked through networks, it becomes very difficult to solve individual problems one at a time in terms of individual interest groups. That is, we now are in a situation in which it becomes necessary to take into account that the changes you take in one area are automatically going to have impacts in another area. And it's very difficult to take all of these things into account. So I think I'll stop there, and thank you.
Thank you. I could not agree more with Ian. That's not surprising, though. So, but I want to ask a question to Elizabeth, and sorry to be so succinct because we have very short time, but I would love to hear. Yeah, and yeah, Elizabeth. I mean, if you were to just make one suggestion for the G20 presidency in terms of what would be the main issue? I mean, India has done a wonderful work, for instance, on energy transition and development, associating that and bringing the subject on many levels. What would be the topic that you say, okay, this is what Brazil should leave as a legacy of questions? I know this is difficult because there's so many crises, but what would be your one shot to say, Brazil, this is how you should show your face?
Sorry, I'll just switch things so that I don't have feedback. I mean, India, of course, also, just in response to the question, to the comment made a little earlier, I really did quite a lot of work on sort of promoting the concept of digital public infrastructure and the work that they have done in that regard in India over the last decade or so. I think, and I'm thinking about this in the context also of where South Africa might position itself, and bearing in mind that both Brazil and South Africa, I think, face many similar challenges, global challenges, one of which, of course, is is inequality, but inequality in the context of the G20 is also very difficult to develop some really concrete ideas around, but it's or actions. But I think the G20 is also not only about concrete actions, but about changing and putting out there new perspectives on old problems. And I thought in that way, sort of the way in which the Indians also discussed digital infrastructure, digital inclusion, there was a strong focus on a just energy transition, I think can be very important also for Brazil in the conversation around inequality, because the reality is that inequality is at one level very much a national issue, but at another level, there are a whole series of things where the world is unequal. Whether we're talking about something that has been close certainly to the way in which South Africa and India have engaged around vaccines, intellectual property rights, and the way that that system is stacked up against actually being able to see some of these issues as global public goods and access by the global south is one example. The other one is in the financial space around cost of capital, where we spoke about debt a little earlier, where developing countries are actually discriminated against in a sense because that. The way in which the credit rating agencies are structured, the way in which private creditors operate means that, and the way in which macroeconomic coordination doesn't happen. Interest rates in the global north all impact on the ability of developing countries to raise finance to be able to meet their development objectives. So that's, for me, if Brazil can take unpack aspects of that inequality dimension, which they've identified, which you have identified as a key priority and key theme in your G20 presidency, and articulate them, 2 or 3 key issues in that inequality chapeau and framework. I think that would be very, very powerful.
Elizabeth, I was hoping you gave the answer. And I think because I really think inequality is the source of all crises. And so I'm happy that I asked the question, but I was crossing my fingers that you would give that answer, and so well done. Thank you so much. Robert, would you like to make a last comment?
So just 2 points. This is to Jan. First of all, I would very much like to know more about this point that you made right at the end, that there is already in existence a private payments clearing union, which presumably then makes it relatively easy to consider how to transform that, or how to build alongside it an international clearing union similar to the idea that Keynes proposed at Bretton Woods. I did not know the content of that diagram in your last slide. I would like to know more. There may not be time for you to elaborate now, but I will certainly be asking you if you can tell us more, because I think that's a really important point to note, that there is already...
Robert, you can find all the information you need on my website. I've been writing about this for the last 5 years. So.
Okay. The second point is that you tended to dismiss the content of my model as rearranging the chairs on the deck, rearranging the chairs on the deck chairs on the Titanic. But any such new organization clearly has to address not just what it is to do, what kind of policies, what kind of issue areas it will take up, which is on the output side, but it has to address the input side, and that means addressing issues, as in our model, of representation and of voice, the distribution of votes in decision making. And that's simply what I was talking about. I deliberately did not talk about what this new body should do. That's a separate, related, but separate issue.
Well, any other questions? Still open to the public. Yes, okay, Carlos. Please.
Well, okay, thank you. I'm very happy to be here and learn a lot about those discussions. And I'd like to bring up a topic that was missing in all these days we are discussing here, because we're facing such kind of collective action problem. In that same time, this international perspective have to deal with such kind of a counter movement, which means basically the return of state itself in order to rearrange such kind of challenge which happen obviously on international level, but basically where the people are. Actually, the people are inside nations, inside frontiers of nations. Means basically at the same time, the state capacities in order to face such challenges are being undermining progressively. For example, in Brazil, when you look at, for example, state-owned companies like Petrobras, like Eletrobras, even the state-owned banks, which has been play a significant role in order to organize financial systems in such kind of directions, has been mostly affected. For example, in this political crisis which took place in 2016. So BNDES, for example, has been changed. When you look at, for example, the interest rate of banks, or even such a kind of regulatory process. So a state-owned company has been submitted of the new state law, means basically the federal government has much more leverage in order to push forward long-term policies, so on and so that. And we can see such kind of process happening at the same, on different levels in other countries, like in India, or in Latin America in general terms. So my question is, not a question, I was just wondering how to manage such kind of a puzzle. Okay, how to overcome the collective action problems, and at the same time deal with the undermine of state capacities. So it's possible to deal with this kind of dilemma, especially when you look at this disruptive process like digital economy, agriculture, energy transition, so on. So it's really striking me how to deal with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that these 3 days, gave us much more than we expected at the very beginning. And I would like to let you know that the 3 roundtables will be continue to work, because we just don't want to stop here. Because we thought that the 3 roundtables that addressed the issue of One Health, the issue that the health of the planet, will continue to meet. And of course, we will produce recommendations for the 5th national conference in SNT, and we will also produce some recommendations to T20. So there is a lot of work to do from now on, and I'm really very happy with all the results. It has been an incredible and amazing dialogue, and I really think that we got more than we expected at the very beginning. So thank you very much. Want to finish? Yeah.
Can we just say that this was the work of this incredible academic scholar and intellectual. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. It's closed. We end this now. Okay, let's have lunch.